story of Ruth is best understood if you read it in its entirety. It's a pretty short book. It's got some really neat lessons and some pretty neat stories in there when you read it. But to understand the story, you have to understand society a little bit in the time when it was written. You see, it's a very patriarchal society, meaning most everything was based on men. They got inheritance. If you weren't married, if you didn't have sons, you basically didn't have a future. So Naomi, her husband has died, and her two sons are died. So she's left with her daughter-in-laws. So they really have no future land, no future anything. So Naomi implores her daughter-in-laws, go back home. I'm going to go back to where I came from, back to the land of Judah. Why don't you go back to where you guys are from, find yourself some husbands so you can have a life. And then we get the wonderful story of Ruth traveling with Naomi. See, Naomi had left with her husband because there was a famine in Judah. They went to a foreign country, Moab, to live because there was food there. And that's where they had sons, her sons got married. And then Naomi's husband died, and her two sons died. So she thought, the only thing left for me is to go back to my ancestors' home and at least be back there with family. And she didn't expect her two daughter-in-laws to go with her. She said, it'd be easier for you guys just go back to where you're from, find somebody there to marry, and start your life over. And of course we hear Orpah, who says, yeah, I think I'll do that. I'll go back home and start my life over with the people I'm used to. And she's doing something that's reasonable. She's trying to survive herself. Of course, you just think is go back to your people. But then we get the story of Ruth, which is what the rest of the book is about, and her declaration of commitment that she makes to Naomi, something that's read quite often at marriage ceremonies. She says that Ruth clung to her. The verb clung is used in one of the more familiar places in the Bible. That's in Genesis, where it says a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. So the verb here is intimately powerful. Ruth is not only just going to travel with Naomi back to Judah, to Bethlehem, she promises to be a partner with her, to support her, and to go back there and to worship her God and become a part of her people. Now, I suppose I can get off onto a diatribe of how one can make that commitment to a mother-in-law, but that would serve any point. But how did she do this? She'd known her for probably 10 years, and she was choosing the hardest part by far, following her mother-in-law to a foreign land with foreign gods and foreign everything, a brand new place for her. But for some reason, she commits herself to Naomi. She says, your God will be my God, your people will be my people. I will support you and we'll make it together. Ruth, who's this foreign woman from Moab, an Arab woman, demonstrated to the Jewish people reading this story, and demonstrates to us what the loyalty of God is like. By word and by deed, Ruth demonstrates what God means when God says, I will never leave you or forsake you. There's a couple things I think we can learn from the story. One is the example of Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi, and how that shows us God's faithfulness to us. And the second is how we kind of choose to interact with family and friends, with people, with community that we know can help us on our journey. The first part of Ruth's faithfulness is giving us a picture of what God's faithfulness is to life, what God's faithfulness is to us. In this story, God is at work in the more subtle ways. We don't see God parting the seas or doing big miracles or having manna fall from the sky. Instead, as we read further in the story, we see God doing kind of work in the margins, if you will. As the story goes on, Ruth and Naomi travel back to Naomi's home in Judah, and it's the time of the barley harvest. And to get food, Ruth goes and kind of walks on the edge of the fields and picks up barley and grain that's been left over. A man notices her doing this, ends up giving her preferential treatment. Long story short, they get married, happy ending, she has a son. But there's all kinds of subtle ways in there where God makes the connections. And looking back, you can see God working through the whole story. Not in powerful, miraculous ways, but kind of on the edges, on the margins. Maybe where we don't notice God working as much until we can look back and say, oh, I remember seeing God there. So as we go along, we see Ruth and Naomi in the story. And we see that Ruth chose to follow Naomi back to her homeland. She chose the more difficult path. And it got me to thinking how often we miss blessings that God wants to offer us because we don't choose that difficult path. How sometimes we think the easier way is going to get us there more quickly, or maybe it'll be more reward, so we choose that. And I'm reminded of the story, I guess one of the harder choices I made in my life so far is that moving down to Minden. Now, it's not that I was moving to a foreign land, a foreign God, and foreign people. Although the Hawkeye and Nebraska fans are close, not quite a foreign country. But it was a choice to move. We were living in St. Paul, and we both had grown up, Tracy and I, in a small town. So that wasn't a large change to move back into a small town. It was a change moving from St. Paul down here. We can't get a pizza delivered quite to the house as easily anymore. But it was a hard choice to make. An easier path might have been finding a church in the cities where we could stay closer to our friends, or finding a church closer to where our families were. At the time we moved, we'd be moving about 4 hours away from our folks instead of 2 hours in the cities or whatever. But we were moving someplace we'd never been. Didn't know anybody, didn't know anything. And so we had a choice to make. You probably heard the story before we made the visit. And we talked. We got the profiles of churches. We picked a couple out. We chose to come down to Minden, and we visited and did the whole preaching thing and ended up moving down. But I remember bits and pieces of conversations that Tracy and I might have had about, is this what we want to do? Is this where we want to go? And I'll tell you, it would have been easier if God would have came down and said, yes, this is where you want to go. Well, I never got a light. I never got a voice. Tracy Ditch never told me that she got one like that. But we had to make the choice. We made it through a lot of prayer, through kind of just deciding that, yeah, I think this is where God wants us to go. So we packed up and moved. Came down to Minden, and almost 7 years later, I think, my math is right, which doesn't seem possible, we're still here. And we haven't been ran out with pitchforks and torches yet. But I think about that choice. And yeah, it might have been easier to look for a church closer to home, a church in the Twin Cities. But I can't imagine all the blessings and things we would have missed out upon. One, in serving this church, the great community we live in, the great school that our kids get to go to, just all kinds of crazy things that we get to do down here and be a part of that never did we dream about when we moved. I don't know what we thought when we moved down here, but I don't mean to sound like that. Not that we weren't thinking when we moved down here, but I don't know what we envisioned when we moved down here our lives would be like. I don't remember what that was, but I know it didn't include or couldn't have imagined all the blessings and great things that have happened to us. And I think about what we could have missed, choosing the easier path. The blessings, the places, the ministry we would have missed out. And that's not to say God wouldn't have been with us if we would have chosen a different place or a different church. And we wouldn't have been happy there too. But to think what we would have missed by taking the easy path. And sometimes we're good at that too, in our lives, by looking at maybe what something might be a little bit more difficult and thinking, I don't think so. God's asking me to do a little too much, to step up a little too far. I don't want to do that. But if we can have the faith to say, let's do it. Let's step out, let's maybe take the harder path, and the blessings that God has for us are something we couldn't have imagined. So Ruth follows Naomi to back home. She chooses the more difficult path. She chooses Naomi because she's family. She chooses Naomi because she probably knows Naomi could use a partner to travel with. They get to the city gate, they get back to Bethlehem, and Naomi says she's bitter. She's too wrapped up in her own grief. She gets back to Bethlehem with royal Ruth at her side, and she announces, I went away full, but now the Lord has brought me back empty. I wonder how Ruth felt about that. Here she chose to follow Naomi back to her home. She stands side by side at the city gate, and Ruth doesn't even get so much as an introduction. I went away full, Naomi says, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Well, that certainly isn't true. Yes, Naomi has gone away and she's experienced a terrible loss, but she didn't come back empty. She came back with her daughter-in-law, someone that has pleasure in life to her, to say, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to be a companion with you. But Naomi doesn't see it because she's so wrapped up in her own grief and her own trouble. Sometimes we also can miss blessings, just as we can by taking the easiest path. Sometimes we do it because we're so wrapped up in our own stuff, we don't notice the help that is around us. And I think that's one of the great things about this church, about this community, is that there is people willing to share the journey with us. There's people that are willing to help us shoulder those burdens, whether it's our church family, whether it's our own family, whether it's our own friends. Just as Naomi had Ruth to help her, we too have people willing to share our burdens with us. Thanksgiving will soon be upon us, although most of the stores seem to skip right till Christmas, I guess. But Thanksgiving, the holidays, and Christmas season will be here, and what do we think? We think family, we think friends, we think celebrations. For some people, they wonder if they can make it through the holiday season. They've been through all this year already, with all the stress, the hurts, the disappointments, the loneliness. They wonder if we'll be able to endure this holiday season. Well, just as Naomi wondered if she could endure, and how she forgot the blessing that she had right beside her, let us remember that the holiday season isn't a time to dread, but a time to express the thanks we have for a God who is faithful to us, for friends, for family who are willing to travel with us, to be our partners, help us through the tough times. God has provided us with someone to serve us through difficult times, not only His Son Jesus, but God has provided us with a loving church family, even with our own friends and own family. Let us not forget them. Let us be thankful for them. Let us be willing to open ourselves up to new experiences, by sometimes taking the road less traveled, by sometimes standing out and taking a risk, but always knowing that as Ruth was promised to be faithful to Naomi, that God has promised, and will be faithful to us. Let us enter this holiday season with the spirit of thanksgiving and gratefulness for the partners that we have to share